Hello, it's Philip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. Today I'm looking at a very important book on a subject which has got a great deal of contemporary concern attached to it. This book is one I found very interesting to read. It's called New Thinking in Islam, and it's called The Jihad for Freedom, Democracy and Women's Rights by Khatijah Amirpour. Now, the title and the subtitle, this is the book, we'll have a look at it, they have changed slightly on some of the internet sites, but we are looking here at New Thinking in Islam and in fact looking at freedom, democracy and the role of women. And that's really what the book is. It's a hardback and it's also an e-book. It's available as an e-book. It's come from the Ginkgo library, and we have given the title of our review appreciation this. It's a litmus test work of scholarship offering a better understanding in 20th century attitudes towards women across the cultures. Now I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's look at the book first of all. There it is. It's a hardback, you can see that. The front and then the back. It's got some very useful dividers there. There is the back inside cover, and there is the front inside cover with the dust jacket. Now what we've got in the book itself, I'm going to go to the front first of all. I will show you that, and then I will also show you that information there, which is the front page, and who it's in memory of. And then we get to the basic information about the book itself, and then the contents section. That's the first part there. There are 8 chapters, and then there's an end piece called The Future of Islam right at the end. Then there are acknowledgements, bibliography and so forth. And then there's a translation, this is a translation, and then there's a foreword, which I have used to a certain extent in this review. And at the back of the book we do have an index, a short index with page numbering to find things, mainly names. It's a list, index of persons basically that they've got there. Then you've got a very substantial amount of bibliographical material, and in the body copy you can see the footnotes at the bottom are clearly setting out what is actually done. You can see the footnotes again there. Now that's the book itself. It runs to something approaching just over 200 pages. I found it wasn't the easiest book again for me to read. I did find it a little bit difficult. I had to think carefully, and I suspect that's partly, there isn't a note about the translation, it's partly the translation, but I think a very good effort has been done to produce this, and I think we do need more books of this nature on the market so that we know where we're going, because Islam has an important role to play in British society and in European Union society, and I hope we stay in, and I hope that continues. And obviously I get my views immediately about remaining within Europe, because we've got these issues to face and we've got to deal with them together, I think, rather than separately. Now what do we say about the book? Well, Professor Amirpour is to be congratulated in our view for her courage in researching these fundamental and pressing issues in Islam for a Western audience. There's never been a more important time when such issues could be researched without the threat of serious intellectual difficulty arising, because the subject matter remains off limits for many different reasons, although the debate has rumbled along for many years. Whether those reading New Thinking in Islam feel this work is merely a smokescreen which continues to cover up dictatorial practices against women, or to justify such practices internationally, may be in for a bit of a surprise, because it hasn't. And it isn't. In essence, the only way to attempt to understand what the words freedom, democracy and women's rights actually mean today to some cultures is to review the interpretation of these words from their own standpoint, if that is possible in view of the sorts of practices specifically conducted against women in some countries, even in 2016, and we all know what these are. The difficulty of getting prosecutions, even in Britain, is very clear as far as the CPS are concerned. Therefore, an open mind is essential, but the book more than makes up for any misgivings one might have with its very high scholastic quality and content. And we are very grateful to Professor Amirpour for the work she's done on this. So what has Amirpour actually achieved here with her thesis? The general statements explaining the purpose of the book argue, she says, quote, that the West's impression of Islam as a backward-looking faith resistant to post-Enlightenment thinking is misleading and, due to its effect on political discourse, damaging. And she's right, because it has its own greatness, and there's no one saying anything other than that. It's just it has to be looked at in a different way. Some impressions are unfortunately not favourable. So in the 8 chapters, what the author's done is she's introduced us to the key thinkers and activists here. Commentators like Abu Zaid, a free-thinking Egyptian Quran scholar. You've got Abdul Karim Soroush, an academic and former member of Khomeini's Cultural Revolution Committee, and Amina Wadud, an American feminist who was the first woman to lead the faithful in Friday prayer. So you see, things are changing, and that's the beauty of the human condition. We do change and adapt, as long as we don't destroy the planet or all of us in the process. But what we're doing and what we're looking at here are the ways in which society has to change and has to mould to new thinking. Now, Amirpour authoritatively describes a powerful yet lesser-known tradition of inquiry and dissent within Islam, one that is committed to democracy and human rights and may well be the forerunner for change. And by examining these many other similar figure ideas, the professor reveals the many ways they reject fundamentalist assertions and instead call for a diversity of opinion, greater freedom, and equality of the sexes. Now, we all accept and take that for granted in our culture here, but we have to be aware that that is not necessarily what happens in other places. It's about education, but what we say is that if you come to this country, you have to basically follow the way we do things here, just as I would do the same thing as I have done if I've actually gone and lived or worked in another country. So there is that quid pro quo, that balance that comes in. And that's where the difficulty lies, because there are people's strong views one way and the other about it. We are, in some people's eyes, of course, on very dangerous ground here, which is why I've tried to word it in a particular way, because where freedom of expression is limited, there can be problems. And in her foreword, Amirpour says that no book about reform in Islam can do without women's voices. It must pose the question about women. It has to be raised. I just go back in either criminological, feminist criminology, feminist jurisprudence issues, go back 40 years and you will see a huge sea change in the way things have happened, with some of the work of the great criminologists looking at the role of women, looking at feminist jurisprudence as well. These show that there are changes and they must be identified and recognised, and that's part of what's being said. The author then goes on to quote Abu Zaid, who, quote, once called it the litmus test, hence our title, for Islam in the modern world, citing this view from Asghar Ali Engineer. Muslim intellectuals, activists and academics today have to recognise that they bear a heavy moral responsibility. They must play an active role in defending the rights of Muslims collectively. And for that reason, the real test is always how these intellectuals pose the question of women. As long as they do not regard it as an important matter, perhaps the most important of all, they cannot be called engaged intellectuals. Interesting. One question, basic. How many women are there in the world? Half. Half the humankind population are women. So therefore you can see there's a fairly strong argument about getting equality in. It's not there, but we're moving towards it, and we've got to make more rapid movement. These books assist to a certain extent because they're not looking for a revolution. We're just looking to argue and put forward principles and see if we can get like-minded agreement. There are a few people who won't agree anything, and you have to accept that. But the point is, if a very large majority in a democracy do, you know where where we can go with the issue. Let me conclude by saying, and so it may come to pass that the day will arrive soon when some decisions liberating women will, rather than might, happen. The writings there have a fundamental wrong. Our conclusion is that books like New Thinking in Islam and other works act as an acceleration for intellectual notice to be taken in this area of much needed reform and change. And that reform and change will come this century, I'm sure. Thank you, Professor Amarpour. And I have been very grateful to her for producing this book because I think it's an important one. So look at it again. There it is, the front. There's the spine. And then there's the back. Some quotes which are sort of mentioned now. I did look at them, but I haven't actually imported them. If we just open it up, this is some comments again. Libertarian theology is mentioned there. You see there's a lot of mixture here of religion, law and culture. You've then got another, Mr. Suresh, more than ideology and state. You've got a whole range of other ones. The point I would make is right at the end is there is a point in the future of Islam. And I'm not going to make any comments. I'm not going to spoil it. There is, in fact, a little poem at the end, which I always will like. We must prepare the ground here. In the words of the poet Sadi, the blessed rain brings forth tulips in the garden, but in the salty steep it brings forth nothing but weeds. That could be steppe. Nothing but weeds. You see the imagery there is very strong. The blessed rain brings forth tulips in the garden, but in the salty steep or steppes it brings forth nothing but weeds. Now that is, I think, an interesting end is to this particular book. I'm sure many more will be produced in due course. This issue will not go away. It's an important issue in Britain, in Europe and in the world. And it could be very important in America too in the next, certainly in the next year or so, with change of presidency and all the problems that are now beginning to emerge. Thank you to all concerned. Very courageous that you've done the work on this. It's a great contribution in a free society to the way we're going. Thank you. Bye-bye.